only one way you can take this, and it's in that ring. Who wants to go toe-to-toe with the champs? This is calling my shot.
Hello, sports world. It is week 4 of the 2020 NFL season. I hope your fantasy teams are doing well, but if not, and you find yourself in a predicament where you're 0-3 or 1-2, don't give up. Watch this video because I'm going to help you turn it around. Starting out, we have our stud quarterbacks of the week. I really like Matthew Stafford going up against the New Orleans Saints. The Saints give up the 29th most points to opposing quarterbacks. The Lions also have Kenny Golladay back, not to mention TJ Hawkinson is playing well. This seems to be a game where it's going to be a shootout, so look for a lot of passing production from Matthew Stafford in this one. Next, we have Joe Burrow, the gunslinger, the man, the myth, the legend, the guy with no offensive line, who throws around 60 passes a game. He's looked great. He's actually a borderline top 10 fantasy football quarterback this year with this atrocious offensive line. Highly impressive. Going up against the Jaguars, who give up the 28th most points to fantasy football quarterbacks. And also, Burrow's getting some pretty great chemistry with T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. AJ Green might be a little bit washed up, but look for Burrow to have a big week. Then we have Jared Goff going up against the G-Men. A good rule of thumb for this year, start anyone that's playing the Giants. While they only give up the 13th fewest points to opposing quarterbacks, Jared Goff has incredible weapons and an incredible offensive system with one of the best offensive-minded head coaches in all of the NFL. And he has weapons like Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Tyler Higbee. Look for a big week out of him. Last, we have Deshaun Watson facing the Panthers. While this matchup looks somewhat tough on paper, I'm really not too worried about it. Deshaun Watson has had a brutal schedule, as we know, up to this point. So I think this is the week that he bounces back and returns to his former glory. Play Watson confidently. Next, Dud quarterbacks of the week. Leave these guys on your bench unless you want to get a Shiva trophy. We have Ryan Tannehill facing off against the Steelers. One thing to keep in mind with this matchup is that the NFL has moved the game to either Monday or Tuesday night. Keep up with the headlines. They might have to cancel it depending on how many more players test positive. So be prepared to have some backups that you can throw in. But if the matchup does proceed, keep Tannehill on your bench. The Steelers are one of the best defenses in all of football this year. Not to mention A.J. Brown still looks like he's going to be riding the bench. Moving on, we have Carson Wentz, who plays for a dumpster fire of a franchise, apparently. It's hard to believe they won the Super Bowl a couple years ago, but they're facing off against the 49ers, who give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Carson Wentz also has 0 weapons to throw the ball to, and Goddard just got hurt. So easily keep him on your bench. Next, we have Phillip Rivers facing off against the Bears. The Bears give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Their defense is always phenomenal. Plus, the Colts are kind of a dump-off and run-oriented offense. Jonathan Taylor seemed to really taken over for that team. Keep Rivers on your bench this week. Last, we have Cam Newton facing off against the Chiefs. I know you're going to be super tempted to start him because of the amount of rushing touchdowns he's already scored this year. He does look great in New England. However, if you watched last week's Monday night game, you know how well the Chiefs did in shutting down Lamar Jackson. Look for them to implement a similar scheme. I'm keeping Cam Newton on all of my benches this week. Next, we have our stud running backs of the week. It's hard to believe that I'm going to recommend starting a Denver Bronco player, but they're facing the Jets, who give up the 29th most points to opposing fantasy football running backs. They are terrible. Adam Gase needs to get fired. That's a whole different discussion. But Gordon's probably one of the only players left on the Broncos that you can start with confidence. Look for him to steamroll the Jets. Next, we have Devin Singletary facing the Raiders. The Raiders just got absolutely gashed by Sony Michel and Rex Burkhead. I think it's pretty safe to assume that Devin Singletary, who is better than both of those running backs, will have a big week this week. Plus, Zach Moss is still sidelined. Next, we have James Conner facing the Titans. Remember what I said earlier about having players that can substitute in if this game isn't played. But if it does proceed forward, play James Conner confidently. The Titans give up the 23rd most points to fantasy football running backs. And James Conner, the last 2 weeks, has had over 100 yards rushing in both of them. Last, we have Austin Eckler facing off against the Buccaneers. I know people were on the Joshua Kelly hype train, but let's be honest. We all know this is Eckler's backfield. Plus, Justin Herbert loves targeting him. And Joshua Kelly fumbled the ball last game, so his touches could be diminished even more. I like this matchup a lot. The Buccaneers go for 21st most points to fantasy football running backs. Play Austin Eckler. Dud running backs for this week, we have Miles Sanders going up against the 49ers. As I alluded to earlier, it's hard to trust any Eagles offensive players, especially when they have a matchup like this against the 49ers who give up the least amount of points to fantasy football running backs. I am confidently benching Miles Sanders. Next, we have David Montgomery facing the Colts. The Colts have one of the stingiest run defenses in the NFL. DeForest Buckner is an absolute run stomper. They give up the 5th fewest points to fantasy football running backs. I am leaving David Montgomery on the bench. Next, we have Antonio Gibson facing off against Baltimore. We all know Baltimore's defense is elite, and Antonio Gibson has shown flashes, and it looks like he's going to take control of that backfield. But if you have other players and you're thinking about using Gibson as your flex this week, I would avoid it. There's better options out there. Last, we have Ronald Jones going up against the Chargers. He's shown some sort of flashes, and for whatever reason, Bruce Arians wants to stick with the guy. If the Chargers give up the 4th fewest points to fantasy football running backs, I would leave him on the bench. Plus, you never know if it's going to be him or Fournette that's going to have a big game. Moving on to the stud wide receivers of week 4. We have Kenny Golladay going up against the Saints. In my PPR league, he scored like 17 points last week, even though he's not 100% healthy. Look, Galladay's an absolute superstar. If he's healthy, you play him. I know on paper this is a bad matchup, but Stafford loves targeting him. He might be the next Megatron. You never know. Play Golladay. Next, we have Robert Woods facing off against the Giants. This is a pretty easy one. Playing the Giants, abysmal secondary, and Robert Woods is one of the most consistent fantasy football wide receivers. Look for him to have a big week this week. Next, we have Devontae Parker facing the Seahawks. Look, the Seahawks have gotten absolutely gashed by fantasy football wide receivers this year. It's honestly ridiculous. Dak Prescott threw for over 400 yards against them. Devontae Parker also looks like he's returning back to form. I would play him confidently. Last, we have Michael Gallup facing the Browns. A good rule of thumb in fantasy football, you always play offensive players against the Browns because it's been a safe bet for the last 20 years. But anyway, Michael Gallup had a really good week last week. Look for him to continue to build on that. The Browns give up the 27th most points to fantasy football wide receivers. Moving on to our dud wide receivers this week, we have DJ Moore facing the Cardinals. The Cardinals have a rejuvenated defense and a great secondary. They give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. And also, Robbie Anderson looks like the number 1 guy in Carolina. I would keep DJ Moore on the bench. Next, we have Allen Robinson, the guy who's trying to get paid. Does deserve it. But he's facing the Colts, who also have a stingy pass defense. They give up the 3rd least points to fantasy football wide receivers. I don't know if I trust Nick Foles. He showed flashes last week, but we don't know which Nick Foles is going to show up. And to me, that's enough to keep Allen Robinson on the bench. Next, we have Julian Edelman facing the Chiefs. Believe it or not, the Chiefs secondary is actually number 1 against fantasy football wide receivers this year. They absolutely shut down the Ravens on Monday Night Football. I know Julian Edelman and Cam Newton have some pretty good chemistry, but I hate this matchup. Last, we have Terry McLaurin facing the Ravens. The problem is he still has Haskins throwing him the football, and it's a really tough matchup. I am keeping McLaurin benched, even though it's tough to put a player of this caliber on the bench. Look at the matchup and see if you have other guys you can play over him. Moving on to our stud tight end of the week. We have TJ Hawkinson facing the Saints. This is going to be a shootout of a game, and the Saints give up the most points to opposing fantasy football tight ends. And Hawkinson has had a solid year so far. He's been incredibly consistent. I don't think Galladay eats up his targets. He's still a huge red zone threat. Look for him to continue to build on his second-year success. Next, we have Dalton Schultz facing the Browns. Is this guy the next Jason Witten? I'm hoping so. It's a shame that Blake Jarwin got injured, but Schultz has received a ton of targets over the last 2 weeks. I really like the matchup with the Browns giving up the 30th most points to fantasy football tight ends. Play him confident. Next, we have Noah Fant versus the Jets. What an absolute weapon this guy is. He's been a top 5 fantasy football tight end this year. It's a shame he doesn't have a quarterback to throw him the ball, but it doesn't matter because the Broncos don't have anyone else they can throw the ball to, and they're also facing the Jets. This is a no-brainer. Next, we have the best fantasy football tight end name in the league, Mo Alley-Cox, facing the Bears. Phillip Rivers, as we know, with Antonio Gates and Hunter Henry, loves to target his tight ends. We've seen that come to fruition the last 2 weeks with Cox. He's looked great, and he has a favorable matchup against the Bears, who give up the 15th most fantasy points to tight ends. Last, our Dud tight ends of the week. We have Mike Gesicki versus the Seahawks. While Gesicki has had an incredible year thus far and has over-exceeded expectations, the Seahawks give up the 4th fewest points to fantasy football tight ends, so I hate the matchup. Next, we have Jimmy Graham facing the Colts. It's weird seeing this guy in a Bears uniform. And believe it or not, he's actually a top 5 fantasy football tight end so far this year. Do not bank on that to continue. I think the downfall starts now. Although he's a Hall of Famer, the Colts give up the fewest fantasy football points to tight ends. Next, we have Hayden Hurst facing the Packers. Hurst has been hit or miss this year so far, and with a bad matchup against the Packers, I'm going to avoid him. He could score a touchdown, but really you're banking on that, and to me, it's too much of a gamble. Last, but certainly not least, we have third leg Greg. Yes, he's a Seahawks player now, which is absolutely crazy. What a year. What a year. 2020 is easily the craziest NFL season I've seen so far. But anyway, he is facing the Dolphins this week. And believe it or not, the Dolphins have given up the 3rd fewest points to fantasy football tight ends. Might be surprising, but I am avoiding Greg Olsen at all costs. Thanks for watching the video. Stay tuned for the next.